So, good afternoon and welcome for this. It's actually the second event we have this afternoon in this library reading room, but it's our annual lecture of the European Parliamentary Research Service. And I'm very pleased to welcome you here. I'm Etienne Basso, I'm the director of the Members Research Service at the EPRS. And I will have the privilege to moderate this lecture this afternoon. A lecture on speeches. A lecture on what only a speech can do. It's actually an oxymoron to have two speechwriters on stage, because normally speechwriters are in the backstage, or they are some of you in the room and prepare speeches for politicians and are not speaking themselves. But today we have them. So what are we going to discuss today? Speeches. It derives from the Latin word parlare, which is in French, parler, to speak, to have a conversation. And over centuries, assemblies are about speaking, debating, having conversation. Etymology reminds us that speech is the heart of speeches, at the heart of the legislative branch. To legislate, you need to speak, to debate, and to convince. So we all understand how speeches are important to us. And to give this lecture, we wanted an expert, someone with years and even decades of experience in speech writing, someone who has a global overview of the profession and issues, and someone who can bring a fresh perspective of an activity that we do all year long here in the Parliament, delivering speeches. So, who better than the founder and executive director of the International Professional Speechwriters Association for this? David Murray is in Europe, and we are delighted to have you with us today, David. Thank you very much for making the trip. From my conversation with David yesterday, I understand that this lecture will be to you, the audience, what our speeches should be to each of our audiences. They should inspire, they should motivate, and they should connect. So let me make a recommendation to our colleagues that are not yet in the room. This is an hybrid event. We have some colleagues in their offices that are online. You still have 3 minutes to run, and to be in the room, you will experience something different. So go on now and run. And I will take the time remaining to give a couple of practical informations. So we have 1.5 hours. I first will give the floor to David. He will make this lecture, what only a speech can do, why we still participate in this ancient ritual, and why it is essential to democratic discourse. And the lecture should lead us close to 3 p.m. I will then invite Isabel Godel-Erhardt, who is our own EPRS specialist on the Speaking with Impact community, to lead the conversation. Isabel was also a speechwriter for Ursula von der Leyen, and she has been also contributing to speeches for prominent politicians in the House here. And then we will have time for questions here in the room as well as online, and you can already use the chat function to send your questions. So, without further ado, once again, most welcome to you, David, for being here, and we are very much looking to hear and to listen a little bit, and to watch a little bit, some pictures about speeches in the past. Over to you, David. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Etienne, for that warm introduction, and to the European Parliamentary Research Service for this incredible and honoring invitation. So flattering. Thank you also to Isabel Godel-Erhardt for suggesting the idea of bringing me over here. And thank you all for coming today. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm not just honored by this invitation. So are my neighbors in Chicago honored by this invitation. Why my neighbors in Chicago? Well, Chicago is a city of neighborhoods. That's the first thing you would say about Chicago. And by the early 20th century, Chicago's neighborhoods were a microcosm of Europe, sort of rearranged. To the north of Chicago, the northerly neighborhoods in Chicago were so German that they might as well have been Germany. To the south, to the northwest of Chicago, the neighborhoods were all Polish It was called Chicago's Old Polonian neighborhood. To the west of Chicago was Italy, and to the south and southwest of Chicago was Ireland. I live on the northwest side, in the heart of the city's Old Polonian area, where in the middle of the 20th century there lived more Poles than anywhere outside of Warsaw in the world. On my daily 4-mile run in Chicago, around Chicago's Humboldt Park, it often feels to me like I am in Europe. I pass this building. I pass this building. More poignant to this moment, I live in Chicago's Ukrainian Village, which is a small neighborhood geographically that contains 15,000 Ukrainians, most of them descendant from people displaced during World War II. That's our tree right there, and the war's gone on so long, sadly, our improvised flag is fading. We'll have to replace that soon, I'm afraid. My next-door neighbors, Orisha to the east and Oksana to the west, were both excited and a little shocked, frankly, that the guy who they always see drinking beer and mowing his lawn was invited here to speak to you. So I understand not only deeply, but personally, the stakes of this moment in Europe and of your election that's coming up this year, and the utter importance of this moment for creating rhetoric that's both powerful and deeply responsible. The essence of the ideas that I'm here to share with you today are not new, but perhaps they're newly urgent, newly relevant on this first day of spring and all the possibilities that that symbolizes for all of us, especially for Europe. Ladies and gentlemen, I've been delivering a version of this talk for, now that I think about it, about almost 2 decades. I've spoken about the purpose and the power of speeches and their unique ability to change human hearts and minds all over the world, all over the US and Canada, all around the UK, where I'm actually headed to talk about this subject a little later this week. I've spoken on this topic in Copenhagen and Brussels here. I once was invited to speak at the United Nations to talk about this and told that a small coterie of people who are really involved in United Nations speeches, maybe 15 people would show up to that speech, and 300 people showed up to that speech. The last time I talked about the power of speeches was in a whirlwind year for me in 2019, when I shared the same ideas that I'm going to share with you today and say the same examples with audiences in Sydney, Australia, at the invitation of the Vice President of the Dominican Republic, with a group of public and corporate officials at the first ever All-African Speechwriting Conference in Gaborone, Botswana, and at the World Conference of the Professional Speechwriters Association with Isabel in Washington, D.C. The speech was a big hit everywhere I went. Everyone seemed to agree with my central message about how physical, in-person speeches had a special, magical, irreplaceable power. And then, a couple of months after I gave that speech, came COVID, and with it came the end of speeches for 1 year, then 2 years, and into 3 years, really. What was lost? Was my message still true? Or had Zoom put the lie to my claim about what only a speech can do? Ladies and gentlemen, we're about to discuss and even decide that here together today. I'm going to deliver my speech mostly unchanged from what I was telling these global audiences more than 3 years ago before COVID. And then with the help of Isabel and Etienne, we're going to talk these ideas over, and with the help of you as well, particularly with a mind to see how these ideas may be constructively applied by you and the leaders you work with over the next crucial year in the history and in the future of the European Parliament. Are you ready to begin?
No man can fully grasp how far and how fast we have come. But condense, if you will, the 50,000 years of man's recorded history in a time span of but a half a century. Stated in these terms, we know very little about the first 40 years, except at the end of them, advanced man had learned to use the skins of animals to cover them. Then about 10 years ago, under this standard, man emerged from his caves to construct other kinds of shelter. Only 5 years ago, man learned to write and use a cart with wheels. Christianity began less than 2 years ago. The printing press came this year. And then less than 2 months ago, during this whole 50-year span of human history, the steam engine provided a new source of power. Newton explored the meaning of gravity. Last month, electric lights and telephones and automobiles and airplanes became available. Only last week did we develop penicillin and television and nuclear power. And now, if America's new spacecraft succeeds in reaching Venus, we will have literally reached the stars before midnight tonight. This is a breathtaking pace. And
a breathtaking pace indeed, in human development and in human communication. President Kennedy used that speech to explain my country's intention and to declare my country's intention to send a man to the moon. I plan to use this speech for a much more modest purpose, to try to explain to you why, despite all the developments in technology and mass communication, I am still standing before you today, as I might have done 50,000 years ago, to give you a speech, and to further explain to myself and maybe to you why you're sitting there patiently, willing to let me do it. I feel I've been preparing to give this talk for a long time now, maybe ever since I became interested in speeches and the people who give them and the people who write them. Actually, maybe before that. Maybe since I was bored by most of the speeches that I heard. Actually, you know, in elementary school, I remember our teacher would make us stand up in front of one another and give speeches that we didn't believe in to classmates who could not have cared less what we were saying. I was bored by speeches at American Independence Day rallies where speakers asked us to be grateful for our freedom, when our childhood lives seemed exactly the opposite of that. Sit up straight, keep your elbows off the table, no more cookies, and it's time to go to bed. I was bored by speeches at school assemblies. I remember my high school superintendent going on and on about concepts like excellence and success that meant nothing to me. Speeches aren't communication, I thought. Communication, I thought, was something that happened in much more intimate situations. You know, in a car with your mother or your father, or at a sleepover with a friend. Communication I loved. And anything that wasn't communication, I hated. And that's what I thought speeches were. Talking, but not communication. Then why have I spent most of my career studying speeches? Because I've spent most of my career growing up and coming to understand the meaning of being a human being. To explain to you and to myself what speeches can do and why we still give them, we have to go back 50,000 years, just as President Kennedy did. That's when the first speech was given. The self-appointed leader of the first prehistoric tribe had some information she wanted to discuss. She had climbed up to the top of a ridge and seen a herd of mastodons far off on the horizon, but coming in this direction. She scrambled down to the cave and told the first person she ran into. When she was sure that person understood, she told that person to tell someone else, and she went and told a fourth person. Well, soon the whole cave was a confused cocktail party cacophony, contradictory conversations, and that's when the cave woman became impatient and said, "Everybody shut up. I've got something important to tell you, and I'm going to tell you all at once." And with that, she made the first speech. It was short, it was to the point, and it was communication. There's a herd of mastodons coming. If you want to eat, I should suggest you sharpen your spears. Thanks for listening, and now I'm pleased to take your questions. And that's what speeches were for roughly the next 49,500 years. Though they became more elaborate and more persuasive and rhetorically sophisticated, thanks to our friends Aristotle and Cicero, speeches were efficiency devices, more or less. I don't have time to talk to everybody individually, so gather everybody together so I can tell you all at once. Well, then came the advent of the Gutenberg Press. Now, if you had something to say, everyone didn't have to come to you to listen to it all at once. You could put it on paper and send it to everyone else, and they could read it at their own leisure. Then, a few hundred years later, still in a blink of the eye in human history, came the advent of radio. Now, a leader could actually be heard to deliver a message. which allowed my country's president, Franklin Roosevelt, to use his voice rather than just his words to convince Americans that the only thing they had to fear was fear itself. And they allowed Winston Churchill to share his determination in the face of long odds with the sound of his voice that we shall never surrender. Then came television. And now a leader could not only be heard to deliver a message, but could be seen delivering it.
Happy Christmas. 25 years ago, my grandfather broadcast the first of these Christmas messages. Today is another landmark, because television has made it possible for many of you to see me in your homes on Christmas Day. My own family often gather round to watch television, as they are at this moment, and that is how I imagine you now. I very much hope that this new medium will make my Christmas message more personal and direct. It's inevitable that I should seem a rather remote figure to many of you, a successor to the kings and queens of history, someone whose face may be familiar in newspapers and films, but who never really touches your personal lives. But now, at least for a few minutes, I welcome you to the peace of my own home. I hope that 1958 may bring you God's blessing and all the things you long for. And so I wish you all, young and old, wherever you may be, all the fun and enjoyment and the peace of a very happy Christmas.
So what did the British people see when they saw that? They saw a nervous and shy and unsure young woman. They saw a serious young woman and watched her confidence kind of grow before their very eyes. And in the end, they saw that very sweet and charming smile. Are we finished here yet? They saw their queen. And over the next few decades, through televised speeches, people became accustomed to hearing what their leaders sounded like, and seeing what their leaders looked like as they delivered words of inauguration and farewell, calls to arms, and calls for peace. And then the internet came along, and then YouTube, and then streaming, which made it possible for leaders to deliver messages anytime they like. Cave Woman had gone viral. Okay, so now what is the social function of a speech? The speech, which began its function in society as an efficiency device, gather everyone around so I can tell you all something important all at once. Now, a speech is just about the least efficient method of communication I could possibly think of. Every video, this speech included, every video you have seen and will see is available on YouTube. I could have very easily recorded this speech from my home office and sent it to each of you via email. You've got to have gotten all the information and even some of the emotion that I feel and a sense of my personality. And you could have done it all without having to come here and sit still for 45 minutes. And you could have done it when you feel like it, not when it happened to work with my schedule or the European Parliament schedule. And you could have done it with a beer in your hand. But no, you set aside your work, you disrupted your routine, you probably inconvenienced a colleague or two, you declined a meeting to come here and sit still and listen to me. Why? Why do we still give speeches? And why do we still go to them? Is it just the force of human habit that's working here? Because we've been doing it for 50,000 years and we just haven't thought to stop? And I actually ask that question seriously. Speeches might be like that. They might be ancient social rituals that will one day seem silly, superstitious, or even barbaric, like animal sacrifices or public executions or a family dinner without Instagram. Maybe. But that's not how it feels to me. Here's how it feels to me. It feels to me as if the purpose of speeches has changed fundamentally. It feels as if speeches are no longer for delivering information, though they can do that still. It feels as if speeches are no longer fundamentally for persuading people to change their minds, although they can still try to do that. It feels as if speeches are no longer for sharing a vision, although they can try to do that, and I think I'm trying to do that with this speech here today. But what are speeches fundamentally for? A very wise speechwriter I know, an Australian named Lucinda Holdforth. Lucinda Holdforth says that speeches aren't for what happens inside of us, but for what happens between us. She quotes the novelist Franz Kafka, who talked about the purpose of a novel. He said that a novel was an axe for the frozen seas inside us, the frozen seas within us. That a novel was an axe for the frozen seas within us. Lucinda Holdforth says that a speech are an axe for the frozen seas between us. A speech is an axe for the frozen seas between us, between me and you, and more importantly, between you and one another. I believe a modern speech is a modern speech, not when an audience is looking attentively or even admiringly up at the speaker, but when the speaker says something to cause audience members to turn and look at one another, or at least be conscious of experiencing the message, the words and the sounds and the sights and the magical mood in the room, in one another's company. How does this work? Well, you've seen this next speech before, but this time, make an effort not to watch Martin Luther King. Watch the audience in front of him and behind him, and listen to the crowd.
Let freedom ring from Stone Mountain of Georgia. Let freedom ring from Lookout Mountain of Tennessee. Let freedom ring from every hill and molehill of Mississippi, from every mountainside. Let freedom ring, and when this happens, and when we allow freedom ring, when we let it ring from every village and every hamlet, from every state and every city, we will be able to speed up that day when all of God's children, black men and white men, Jews and Gentiles, Protestants and Catholics, will be able to join hands and sing in the words of the old Negro spiritual, free at last, thank God Almighty, we are free at last.
See that audience is almost literally bouncing off of one another. And they're yelling throughout the speech as if they're at a musical event, a concert. That's a fundamentally different experience than they would be having if they were listening to that wonderful speech in their offices or in their homes via YouTube. And it can potentially have much more profound results. And that can only happen with a speech. And watch it happen with this next speech from the same era, but a little closer to home for you. This is Charles de Gaulle in 1962, speaking of reconciliation in Berlin and speaking in German. And remember, this is less than 20 years after World War II. Watch the audience during this clip.
Im September 1962 besucht Staatspräsident de Gaulle die Bundesrepublik.
Wenn Sie alle so mich herum versammelt sehe, wenn ich Ihre Kundgebungen höre, empfinde ich noch stärker als zuvor die Würdigung und das Vertrauen, das ich für Ihr großes Volk, jawohl, für das große deutsche Volk hege. Es lebe Bonn, es lebe Deutschland, es lebe die deutsch-französische Freundschaft.
He spoke of a speech being a speech when a speaker says something that makes the audience look at one another. Did you see this? That's what I'm talking about. A speech does another thing that no other communication medium can do. It offers an opportunity for the leader to prove one's courage by physically showing up in front of what might be a hostile or even an indifferent audience. It's a lonely thing to stand in front of an audience that might disagree with you, and just in doing it, the speaker gets an unbelievable amount of credit. As Simone Weil did in 1974 when she faced down a French National Assembly audience made almost exclusively of men, and in doing so, changed the very terms of the conversation about abortion in France.
Je le dis avec toute ma conviction, l'avortement doit rester l'exception, l'ultime recours pour des situations sans issue. Mais comment le tolérer sans qu'il perde ce caractère d'exception, sans que la société paraisse l'encourager? Je voudrais tout d'abord vous faire partager une conviction de femme. Je m'excuse de le faire devant cette assemblée presque exclusivement composée d'hommes. Aucune femme ne recourt de gaieté de cœur à l'avortement. Il suffit d'écouter les femmes. C'est toujours un drame. C'est toujours un drame, cela restera toujours un drame. C'est pourquoi, si le projet qui vous est présenté tient compte de la situation de fait existante, s'il admet la possibilité d'une interruption de grossesse, c'est pour la contrôler et autant que possible en dissuader la femme. Nous pensons ainsi répondre aux désirs, conscients ou inconscients, de toutes les femmes qui se trouvent dans cette situation d'angoisse, si bien décrite et analysée par certaines des personnalités de votre commission spéciale a entendu au cours de l'automne 1973. Actuellement, celles qui se trouvent dans cette situation de détresse, qui s'en préoccupe? La loi les rejette non seulement dans l'opprobre, la honte et la solitude, mais aussi dans l'anonymat et l'angoisse des poursuites. Contraintes de cacher leur état, trop souvent elles ne trouvent personne pour les écouter, les éclairer et leur apporter un appui et une protection. Parmi ceux qui combattent aujourd'hui une éventuelle modification de la loi répressive, combien sont-ils ceux qui se sont préoccupés d'aider ces femmes dans leur détresse? Combien sont-ils ceux qui, au-delà de ce qu'ils jugent comme une faute, ont su manifester aux jeunes mères célibataires la compréhension et l'appui moral dont elles avaient un si grand besoin?
Now I'd like to share with you the best example I know of the power of a speaker showing up and standing and delivering in a difficult or dangerous circumstance. I don't know if you know this story, so I'll tell you in case you don't. It was 1968. Robert Kennedy, his brother having been shot and killed in 1963, was running for president. And he was making a routine campaign stop in Muncie, Indiana, and he was going to get on an airplane and fly to Indianapolis to give a speech, a campaign rally speech to an all African-American neighborhood on the south side of Indianapolis. As he's getting on the plane in Muncie to go to Indianapolis, a short flight, he's told that Martin Luther King has been shot in Memphis, Tennessee. And as he gets off the plane in Indianapolis, he learns three things. He learns, first of all, that King has died from his wounds. He learns, second of all, that his staff assumes he's not going to go in and make this campaign appearance because it's got to be canceled because this terrible thing has happened. And three, he also learns that the police will not give him an escort to that campaign rally because there's been reports that unrest is starting to happen around the nation as a result of this murder. And he insists on going anyway. He says, I've got to go in and say something. I'm not going to give the campaign rally speech, of course, but I'm going to go in there and say something. I've got to. So he goes in, he writes down a couple things on an envelope, and he goes and he stands up on the back of a flatbed truck in this neighborhood. And if you listen to the very beginning of this and listen to it very closely, you hear him ask, do they know about Martin Luther King? And somebody says, we've left it up to you. So he's got to deliver the news and then deliver some kind of message. And you can tell when he begins this speech that he's nervous and his voice is quavering, and you can tell the feeling that he feels. And so listen to this.
Do they know about Martin Luther King? We have left it up to you. lower those signs, please. I have some very sad news for all of you, and that is that Martin Luther King was shot and was killed tonight in Memphis. Martin Luther King dedicated his life to love and to justice between fellow human beings. He died in the cause of that effort. In this difficult day, in this difficult time for the United States, it's perhaps well to ask what kind of a nation we are and what direction we want to move in. For those of you who are black, considering the evidence evidently is that there were white people who were responsible, you can be filled with bitterness and with hatred and a desire for revenge. We can move in that direction as a country, in greater polarization, black people amongst blacks and white amongst whites, filled with hatred toward one another. Or we can make an effort, as Martin Luther King did, to understand and to comprehend and replace that violence, that stain of bloodshed that is spread across our land, with an effort to understand compassion and love. For those of you who are black and are tempted to be filled with hatred and mistrust of the injustice of such an act against all white people, I would only say that I can also feel in my own heart the same kind of feeling. I had a member of my family killed, but he was killed by a white man. But we have to make an effort in the United States. We have to make an effort to understand, to get beyond or go beyond these rather difficult times. My favorite poem, my favorite poet was Aeschylus. He once wrote, "Even in our sleep, pain which cannot forget falls drop by drop upon the heart, until in our own despair, against our will, comes wisdom through the awful grace of God." What we need in the United States is not division. What we need in the United States is not hatred. What we need in the United States is not violence and lawlessness, but is love and wisdom and compassion toward one another, feeling of justice toward those who still suffer within our country, whether they be white or whether they be black. We can do well in this country. We will have difficult times. We've had difficult times in the past, but we will have difficult times in the future. It is not the end of violence. It is not the end of lawlessness, and it's not the end of disorder. But the vast majority of white people and the vast majority of black people in this country want to live together, want to improve the quality of our life, and want justice for all human beings that abide in our land. And dedicate ourselves to what the Greeks wrote so many years ago, to tame the savageness of man and make gentle the life of this world. Let us dedicate ourselves to that and say a prayer for our country and for our people. Thank you very much.
Now that isn't an example of a perfectly crafted piece of rhetoric. There's a lot of repetition in that, there's a lot of stumbling, there's a lot of searching for words, but it is an example of what a speech can do. It gives a speaker a chance to communicate physically by showing up and searching for the right words. And it gives an audience a chance to feel that moment physically, spiritually, together with one another. A few years ago, I traveled from Chicago to Indianapolis to visit that spot. I was curious to see what was there and what it was like. This wonderful, these two statues are there. That's Robert Kennedy and Martin Luther King reaching across the sidewalk. And there's a ceremony they have there every year commemorating the speech and the sentiment. Now, often when I share American examples of speeches like that in Europe, I hear the reply, well, that's really great, but that would never work in our culture. My minister would never say that or act that way. The idea being that European leaders are loath to share personal anecdotes and origin stories, loath to connect their humanity with the position that they're in. And I agree that American speakers and the American tradition is generally more enthusiastic about that notion. But however speakers like to present themselves, European audiences are not fundamentally different from American audiences or from audiences anywhere else. Audiences at a speech, especially those who would be led by the speaker who is delivering the speech, really want to know two things from the speech. And they want to know them almost simultaneously. First, they want to know what makes that person special. Why is that person up there and I'm down here? And they want there to be a really good answer to the question. They want the question to be answered because they want to have confidence in that person's competence. They want there to be a good answer to why that person's special. But at the same time, they have another question that's also important. Is that person enough like me that she or he understands what it is like to be me, what our community needs? So why is that? Is that person special? And also, is that person common? And that's one way, that's something a speech can get across like almost no other instrument. So let's look at how a European leader got his specialness and also his humanity across in a TEDx talk a few years ago. This is a more perfectly crafted speech, and it was written by Annelies Breedveld, a woman speechwriter at the Defense Minister of the Netherlands, for the Defense Minister of the Netherlands, and he tells his origin story in a very different way, in a very different style. And this is about 7 minutes, so just settle in. He takes his time with this, but it's the same thing.
As the highest military commander of the Netherlands, with troops stationed around the world, I'm really honored to be here today. When I look around this TEDx Amsterdam venue, I see a very special audience. You are the reason why I said yes to the invitation to come here today. When I look around, I see people who want to make a contribution. I see people who want to make a better world by doing groundbreaking scientific work, by creating impressive works of art, by writing critical articles or inspiring books, by starting up sustainable businesses. And you all have chosen your own instruments to fulfill this mission of creating a better world. Some chose the microscope as their instrument. Others chose dancing or painting or making music like we just heard. Some chose the pen. Others work through the instrument of money. Ladies and gentlemen, I made a different choice. Thanks. Ladies and gentlemen, I share your goals. I share the goals of the speakers you heard before. I did not choose to take up the pen, the brush, the camera. I chose this instrument. I chose the gun. For you, and you heard already, being so close to this gun may make you feel uneasy. It may even feel scary. A real gun at a few feet distance. Let us stop for a moment and feel this uneasiness. You could even hear it. Let us cherish the fact that probably most of you have never been close to a gun. It means the Netherlands is a peaceful country. The Netherlands is not at war. It means soldiers are not needed to patrol our streets. Guns are not a part of our lives. In many countries, it is a different story. In many countries, people are confronted with guns. They are oppressed. They are intimidated by warlords, by terrorists, by criminals. Weapons can do a lot of harm. They are the cause of much distress. Why then am I standing before you with this weapon? Why did I choose the gun as my instrument? Today, I want to tell you why. Today, I want to tell you why I chose the gun to create a better world. And I want to tell you how this gun can help. My story starts in the city of Nijmegen, in the east of the Netherlands, the city where I was born. My father was a hard-working baker. But when he had finished work in the bakery, he often told me and my brother stories. And most of the time, he told me this story I'm going to share with you now. The story of what happened when he was a conscript soldier in the Dutch armed forces at the beginning of the Second World War. The Nazis invaded the Netherlands. Their grim plans were evident. They meant to rule by means of repression. Diplomacy had failed to stop the Germans. Only brute force remained. It was our last resort. My father was there to provide it. As the son of a farmer who knew how to hunt, my father was an excellent marksman. When he aimed, he never missed. At this decisive moment in Dutch history, my father was positioned on the bank of the River Waal near the city of Nijmegen. He had a clear shot at the German soldiers who came to occupy a free country, his country, our country. He fired. Nothing happened. He fired again. No German soldier fell to the ground. My father had been given an old gun that could not even reach the opposite riverbank. Hitler's troops marched on, and there was nothing my father could do about it. Until the day my father died, he was frustrated about missing these shots. He could have done something. With an old gun, not even the best marksman in the armed forces could have hit the mark. So this story stayed with me. Then in high school, I was gripped by the stories of the Allied soldiers. Soldiers who left the safety of their own homes and risked their lives to liberate a country and a people that they didn't know. They liberated my birth town. It was then that I decided I would take up the gun. Out of respect and gratitude for those men and women who came to liberate us. From the awareness that sometimes only the gun can stand between good and evil.
Now you see, that style is very different from the style of a Robert Kennedy, more reserved, more formal, but he's doing the very same thing. He's showing people at once that he's competent, but that he's also passionate, that his life's mission is informed by his true, personal, compassionate experience. And that, whether audiences realize it or not, is why they still come to see a speaker speak. What do speeches do? They only do what is needed to be done in our society, our increasingly electronic, remote, fleeting, fluttering society, our divided society. They allow leaders to offer their ideas through their humanity. They connect people to leaders in a very authentic and human way, in a lasting way. And they connect people to one another in an emotional and even a spiritual bond. The American novelist John Steinbeck wrote about this when he talked about a phalanx, when a group of human beings congeal into a separate organism in the way human cells work together to form a person. The phalanx has emotions of which the unit man is incapable, Steinbeck said. My hero, Muhammad Ali, expressed the same idea much more succinctly when asked for a poem after giving a lecture at Harvard University. He said, "Me, we. Me, we." That's what speeches do. Me, we. Believing that and understanding how to make it happen in the mind of an audience, that's the difference between being a famous professional fighter and being a global ambassador for peace and love. So no, speeches don't do much anymore. They only do what our society needs most. They help us connect with one another. I think that's why I was invited, and I think that's why you came. I think I probably did not teach you anything that you didn't already know personally. But I came in the hope that perhaps I could tell you something that you have perhaps not shared communally. Lucinda Holdforth has a wonderful book on leadership communication called Leading Lines. In the introduction, she marvels at how we give speeches still in this age of distraction. And here's why, she thinks. Perhaps it is because there is some rough magic in the communal experience of listening that comes with giving an individual the opportunity to speak their considered thoughts aloud in the welcoming presence of others. We come together to breathe in tandem, to experience our own responses and feelings alongside each other. And sometimes, if we are lucky, and if the speaker speaks truly, in deep connection with each other. We come together like this because to speak freely and to listen attentively is to be human, to express a core human capacity and a central democratic freedom. I hope I have spoken truly today, and I thank you for listening, and I'm happy to start a conversation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, David, for this lecture. That has been absolutely great. And to the ones that where I said at the beginning, you should run here. I saw that a few did, were actually standing behind. I hope they have a seat now, but it was really worth feeling this community. And I was watching from my place also how people were reacting. And that's much more interesting than on the screen, really. So thank you for all that. And please, Isabelle, you will lead our conversation now. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Etienne. Colleagues, members of the audience in this packed room and also online, I've seen there are more than 150 colleagues around the world following, friends of good speeches and powerful words. This lecture you just heard, I remember very well the first time I listened to it. As David mentioned earlier, it was at the Professional Speechwriters World Conference, and I was a member of the audience, and I remember what it created among us, listening with much attention, as from there I could observe you listening with much attention, and at one point turning to each other, turning and looking at each other. I remember that at the time we would exchange a word when it was moving and exchange a smile when it was funny. At sitting from that spot, I had the best spot to observe an audience going through it again, and I noticed the same. Actually, with time, at the beginning it was really full attention to the speaker, but with time I could see some movement in the rooms, and I also, which I hadn't expected, experienced it with Etienne looking at me from time to time when there was really an idea connection, something is happening among us as we listen to it. It reminded me the first time I noticed this effect of great speeches very clearly, distinctly. It was during a major speech for Europe, a speech probably many of you have listened to or watched. It is when the European Union got the Nobel Peace Prize in 2012. The Nobel lecture was delivered by Herman van Rompuy, and here's a short abstract.
When Konrad Adenauer came to Paris to conclude the Coal and Steel Treaty in 1951, one evening he found a gift waiting at his hotel. It was a war medal, une croix de guerre, that had belonged to a French soldier. And his daughter, a young student, had left it with a little note for the Chancellor as a gesture of reconciliation and of hope. I can see
I had planned to ask, did you see Chancellor Merkel and François Hollande? But from the reaction in the room, I will not even ask. Now, still, let's watch again these two leaders. Turning to each other and saying something. We don't know what they say. It very much looks like very moving. This speech achieved exactly this. Members of the audience turning and looking at one another. And when we think about it, it's not any members of the audience, nor any leaders. The peace lecture was for these two countries which had fought for so many centuries, so atrocious wars. So it was really so meaningful for the two of them to connect on this. Turning and looking at one another, but not only when it was moving. Here's another abstract, a few sentences later, when President Van Rompuy was describing negotiations at European level.
Admittedly, some aspects can be puzzling, and not only to outsiders. Ministers from landlocked countries passionately discussing fish quota. Euro parliamentarians from Scandinavia debating the price of olive oil. The Union has perfected the art of compromise. No drama.
So, David, you might have to add a line to the lecture, which is turning and looking at one another and leaning forward to speak to the other members. They just couldn't resist, and they had to share what they would feel. For those of you, by the way, who are interested in this speech, I draw your attention on a project from the European Parliament on the speeches that have made Europe. This speech, as well as many others, are available online and also in the Info Hub, just downstairs in this very building. We shine a spotlight on the speeches that have made Europe. And this spotlight is a selection, presentation, and translation of all these speeches. But back to the lecture. David, I'm grateful you have addressed upfront the reservation that speeches with a personal touch would not work in Europe. This Nobel lecture, I see a speechwriter reacting like, no, of course not, very good. This Nobel lecture, delivered by a European speaker in Europe to a European audience, a speech that is quintessentially European achieved just that. So it's not an American fad, it's as American as it is European, it is actually universal. And I think we will never say it enough, as we are still a bit shy about going in this direction. In defense of great speeches, I would like to address another concern I often hear. The concern goes, oh, but I'm not Martin Luther King, I'm not John Kennedy, I don't give speeches, I only make presentations. So the idea is that here at this pulpit, you have Martin Luther King and John Fitzgerald Kennedy and Herman von Rompuy and Simone Weil and Demosthenes and Louis Weiss and President Zelensky here. And now let me use the spectrum of the stage. Can you hear me? Yes, it works. And at the opposite here, there would be the presentations, and I would say there, the boring presentations. So here, the presentations about our policies, and most of what we do would be here, like on this stage, and very far from the qualities of good speeches and rhetoric here. David, so my first question to you would be, how does what you have shared with us, which is rhetoric, apply not only to the historic political speeches, but also to policies, also to our presentations, also to our staff meeting, also to our everyday work? So this will be my first question. My second question will be on the me-we. So you presented me-we in the European Parliament think tank, in the Speaking with Impact Committee of Practice that I lead. When I train colleagues about speaking with more impact, I explained that the movement of a speech should be, so there should be some words from the speaker, building the ethos of the speaker. So this is the I or the me. There should be something, of course, ultimately about the community, the together, we. And in between, I insist on showing that we have listened to the audience, that we address their needs, their expectations. So you, a bit of I, me, more you, and even more we. So the second question, David, is from the me, we, or the I, you, we, do we actually mean the same thing with different words? Or is there a deeper difference here?
I can't remember two questions in a row. How am I supposed to keep two questions in my head?
And of course, can I?
Go ahead.
Can I go with the third and then we go?
A third?
Yeah, of course, a third. Well, three speechwriters, of course, things go by three. Yeah. So, and of course, I would have had many others, but I will focus on one. And as a speechwriter, of course, I will close on a call to action. We are all aware that rhetoric, good rhetoric, rhetoric for good is not a given. We have seen on your continent, as on ours, that rhetoric and powerful speeches can also be used to divide. I hear your lecture as an invitation for rhetoric that brings us together, not on the same position, not on the same opinion, but in the same debate, in the same conversation with one another, as a call for speechwriters and speakers to work in this direction, to make an effort to understand, to quote Robert Kennedy in the speech you just heard, and which is also the title of the latest book you published, An Effort to Understand. So what does it take to, David, that's the question, what does it take to reach this level of rhetoric? For the speaker, for the speechwriters, for the audience as well? In other words, would you have one advice to give us here in Europe 1 year ahead of the next election? So the three questions are, how does rhetoric apply not only to these speeches, but also to what's there? The second, me, we, I, you, me, do we mean the same thing? And the third, a piece of advice for us ahead of an electoral year. And with it, I close.
I'll do my best on all three of those, and I'll try to do them in order. So I think that most of the principles of rhetoric can be applied at any level of rhetoric, from giving a huge speech to having an argument with your spouse. But obviously the style and the scope and the style is going to be different from how you're going to present in such a way. But like, for instance, I talk about, what an audience wants to know from a speaker. How is that person special? And how is that person like me? Well, that's what you want to also know from your boss every single day. Every day you want to know that that person's special. And every single day you want a reminder that that person actually knows what it's like to be you. And that's kind of universal. Some of the principles we teach speakers, which is, winnow it down to one message. Every speech has to be one message. So many speakers like to get up and they like to say, I'm going to talk about 7 things today. Well, imagine you go home. You're in that audience, and you go home, and you're talking to your spouse at the end of the day, and you're both tired, and you're pouring a glass of wine, and your spouse wearily says, well, how was your day today? And you say, oh, it was pretty good. I went to a speech. And your spouse warily says, what was the speech about? Now, what would your spouse say if you said, the speech was about 7 things? They would kill you. So a speech has to be about one thing. Everything has to be about one thing. So these principles really do apply. That applies in a staff meeting. You walk out of a staff meeting. What was that about? Well, we took a bunch of notes, but what was the main thing that happened in that meeting? What was that meeting really about? Everybody should come out of that meeting knowing what the primary thing is here. Speakers drive speechwriters crazy all the time because they want to give a different speech everywhere they go. They should be giving the same speech everywhere they go with variations. When you think about, when you talk about things your parents taught you, you don't usually say, my mother once said. You say, my mother always said. Always. My father always told me. That's what gets remembered, and those things work in family situations, they work in marriages, they work with colleagues, they work with your staff, and they work in politics. So I think these things are pretty universal. They just have to be applied with great emotional intelligence to each scenario, each scope. And I forgot the other 2 questions. No, I didn't. So the me-we thing, I can't know exactly what was on Muhammad Ali's mind with that. But what I will say about speeches is, now that we are down to a speech being such an inefficient thing to do, such a weird thing to come and sit and be quiet and not look at your phone and like try to actually listen to a human being, an audience needs to know that only this speaker could be delivering only this message to only this audience at only this moment in time. An audience deserves to know that. And if it's not all 4 of those, it should be 2 or 3 of those. Because an audience should understand, my God, this is a total imposition on my time, and I could be doing 100 other things, including watching this speaker on YouTube somewhere else. So why am I here? I should be here for a truly vital reason, and that's the you. That you should understand. You should come here and say, okay, I know why this guy came here, and why he was invited to say this stuff to me today. Now, the beginning of our election year. And if you feel that way, then maybe you feel that this was worth coming to. And if you don't feel that way, you probably think, I should have just seen this guy on YouTube for 20 minutes and gotten on with my day. And then finally, what was the last one? Oh, it was about, yes, advice for the next year. Yes. Look, as you can tell, I don't have a ton of faith in speeches as things that can change audiences' minds. I think speeches can reach out to audiences who are maybe disagreeing with you partly and say, you can show up and be courageous and say, I showed up and I talked to you, and I respect your opinion, and I hope you respect my opinion. It can be an olive branch. But I can't think of the last time I went to a speech with one attitude and came out of it thinking a totally different way. I don't think that that's actually that realistic, and I don't think it happens very often. I think what speeches do is they galvanize audiences that don't know that they have a lot in common. So they think they're from 7 different communities. They think they're from, I'm a researcher, I'm a speechwriter, I'm from Brussels, I'm from Copenhagen. And the speaker speaks about a subject and a set of values that the audience realizes, oh, we have all that in common. We are one. We really are one. So a speech can take an audience that's sort of not galvanized and galvanize that audience on a reasonable basis. So that's a wonderful gift, and it's also a dangerous gift. We've seen what happens when that goes wrong. We saw that at Nuremberg. We saw that with Trump rallies. I mean, everybody was having a great time at those Trump rallies, and a lot of people from a lot of different walks of life were having a great old time at that speech and feeling like they were all galvanized, they were all one. So this is a dangerous power as well, and it requires great responsibility and great care and great morality on the part of the speechwriter, on the part of the speaker, on the part of everybody involved in the creation of a speech.
Thank you very much, Isabel, for taking us to your thinking about speeches and giving also European examples that I think are very relevant for the colleagues here. I remember that speech in Oslo from President Van Rompuy. That was really extraordinary. And thank you, David, for giving us these hints for our own work. We have now about 20 minutes for a discussion, and the floor is open. Isabel is also watching our chat, and I see that there are a couple of questions that have arrived, but maybe we give first a chance to the room. So who wants to make a remark or comment, which I hope to be short and sharp, since we have little time. Yes, please, in the front here.
I'm Sten Lomstedt. I work in the EPRS, and I used to be a speechwriter. That sounds like sort of confession, but you never cease to be a speechwriter. I was wondering, David, and also Isabel, how do you, as a speechwriter, feel of the difference between drafting and delivering a speech of your own making?
Big pong. So who wants to start? Maybe we have a first reaction. Isabel first.
Have the first reaction.
Writing on delivering.
Thank you, Sten. I'm not sure on which tone I should say this word. It's great from time to time as a speechwriter. So typically backstage, as Etienne said at the beginning, we work comfortably in our office, in the comfort behind our screen. We write, we research. But from time to experience what the speaker is going through, there is nothing such as rehearsing several times. And really good experience for speech. I remember, so we worked, Sten and I worked together. I remember we would read our speeches to one another, which is also really good practice for speakers and for speechwriters to improve. And it's really doing this, but in front of more people. And you see the reaction, which is great, that as a speechwriter you never get. So it's a great experience for a speechwriter from time to time to go through what the speaker is going through. Probably also gives us more credibility when we advise, and we realize the difficulties like breathing, smiling, eye contact, not being too moved, the time that is running, and so on. A few remarks on the spot on this.
I would add only that, I think of a speech as music. I think prose should have rhythm as well, but a speech is musical as it is intellectual in my mind. That's what it's for. So I tell young speechwriters that the only kind of true malpractice in speechwriting is to write a speech and hand it to your speaker before you've read it out loud. You must read the speech out loud. You must know how it hears, how it sounds, how it resonates. A speechwriter I know has talked her speaker into letting he listens while she reads the speech to him, which I love that idea if there's time for that, because then the speaker says, oh, that's how that's supposed to sound. I see. It goes up there and the rhythm is here. But I think she's right. I think reading the speech out loud and understanding this is a different form of communication. This is as much music as it is prose.
Elena, please. And then in the front. Well, first Elena and then.
Thank you very much. I'm Elena Lazaro, also from the EPRS. And I have to thank Isabel. I was inspired because when I saw Merkel and Hollande exchanging views, I thought, what if in 20 years a Ukrainian and a Russian leader are sitting next to each other and looking at themselves this way? But I have a very concrete question. Thank you for your inputs. We work in a multilingual environment, and my question is, can a speech do what it can do when it's written to be delivered in a number of languages through interpretation? Are there any tips for that? Thank you.
Again, I want to defer to Isabel on that, because I don't have that much experience in that.
Elena, thank you for the first remark. I'll come to the question. For the first remark, actually, when I mentioned that I would use this speech to David, I told him exactly this. Just imagine. I mean, this is so, so, so powerful. And the link between your remark and the question is, I think one of the greatest miracles of the European Union or the European project is that indeed we managed to have powerful speeches, even with interpretation in so many languages. I think it's extra work for the speechwriters, because when it will be interpreted, we have to think that we cannot use the typical sentence or association of words that would work in one language and will be highly translatable in the others. We should work more with images, pictures that can be easily translated, and this is actually really good stuff for speeches. In the several abstracts that David projected, there were a lot of visual words. So I think this is good. We are also blessed with fantastic interpreters. And a good practice is to hand them the speech before or when there is the time to explain one of the things. It's an additional constraint and difficulties as we work, but it gives even more satisfaction when you achieve. And we can achieve. I mean, look at this speech. Huh? Yeah. So we can achieve this, of course.
And I'll only add that I gave this speech in the Dominican Republic. It was translated, and I was gratified to see it had the similar effect to an audience. A woman got up and said, she said, how do you find your beliefs and find them so sincerely that you can express them so passionately? And I said, I don't know, but it took me at least 50 years to do it. So I think if you use language that isn't real to one language, and you use images, I think that's the best advice. Yeah.
I think in the European environment, what is striking in the plenary in Strasbourg or in Brussels is that even if you don't understand always the language, this body language and the atmosphere in the room plays also a role. And we had very powerful speeches that maybe you don't understand to the extent of a native speaker, but because the person is in the room, and because there is this eye connection, and because there is a certain tone, then there is a vivid debate, and that's something that we are observing. In the front here, yes.
Thank you so much. My name is Giga. I'm a EPP trainee, country of Georgia. So first of all, it's a great experience for me to listen to the speechwriters, professionals, and I'm always curious to listen from the speechwriters. What we should never use the words while we're introducing ourselves to society as a politicians. Thank you.
You have thoughts? Words you should never use? I mean, there are a million taboos. One of the things that I think a speechwriter, this is one of the things that was so upsetting to me about the beginning of the Trump administration in my country, because aside from the politics, it was the rejection of norms. It was the rejection of, this is one of the things that a speechwriter knows is what you can say and what you shouldn't say and what you might get away with and what's kind of edgy to say. And sort of Trump just sort of blew all that stuff up and lie. It was okay to lie. It was okay to say any crazy thing. So I think a speechwriter, I don't think it's usually comes down to things you wouldn't say, obviously, obscenities and racist, like bad things. But it's a speechwriter has a subtle understanding of where the line is, where the edge is, what's kind of interesting, what's getting too interesting, and what's over the line. Do you have any thoughts to add to that?
Yes, maybe three. The first is a speechwriter should use exactly what you use, and I thank you for this, repetition. Never, ever, ever. That was powerful. Then the second thing, a speechwriter should avoid as much as possible abstract words and replace them with concrete, tangible, vivid, detailed words. I just missed the third. Sorry, it will come back. I was so much in my thinking with examples. Sorry, it will come back, and otherwise I'm happy to answer it later. Sorry, just thought it's left.
Yes, the gentleman in the back here.
Oh, yes, sorry, it's back. Sorry.
Oh, it's back.
If you don't mind. Figures.
Yes, finish, Isabel, and then, yeah.
Figures. I try to say no figure in the speech. Your figures in the written communication that complement the speech, online, brochures, leaflet, publication, whatever. Maximum 1 figure. Oh, okay, 2. But not 10 or 20 figures. Repetition, more. Abstract, none. Figures, as few as possible, preferably none.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Tanveer. I work here in the private sector. My interest in speech writing comes from being part of the speech writing inputs team for the Prime Minister in my home country of India. I have a question, it's quite general. So it is my opinion that a good speech is punctuated by applause, but a great speech is interrupted by applause. Ms. Erhardt here mentioned that when somebody gives a great speech, people turn around, look at each other, they lean forward and things. But what do you do when you do not have this feedback mechanism? So if I have to deliver a speech online, what makes a good speech online, and what cues do I need to know to see if I have delivered a good speech online?
Thank you. Very interesting one. Thank you. Who wants to react on this? Or you need to think a little bit?
Yeah, I would say online, the problem with online is that one of the reasons that speeches are interesting is the same reason it's interesting to go to like race car, car races. There's a chance something terrible is going to happen. And like, probably not is something terrible is going to happen, but something's going to happen. And this is a human thing happening here, and it's all impromptu. When you realize that somebody's just sitting at their desk giving a Zoom speech, it takes a lot of the fun and excitement out of it. And so I think that speech has to be shorter. I think in general, I think it has to be more emotional and really direct and deep into the camera, and really heartfelt. But I really emphasize shorter on that. I don't think too many people can mesmerize a TV screen or a Zoom screen for 20 minutes. And so I think that's my thought. And to your point about a speech being interrupted by applause, I think that's true of maybe a political rally. I don't think that's necessarily true. I really do feel like, and I don't even think an audience member has to look at each other. I really make that point. Sometimes it's just, hey, somebody said something, and I'm going to talk to Etienne about that later because that was interesting, and I wonder what he thought about that. And so I think there's a sort of a range of emotional responses people can have to speeches, and it shouldn't feel like a failure if it doesn't include cheering.
A few additional ideas. If you can rehearse your speech before delivering it online with 1 or 2 colleagues, or also sometimes people who have no clue about it, but just listen and see if there is some emotion coming. In addition, because I fully agree with what you said on the length, I also saw in the comments, I was monitoring the conversation for the colleagues who are watching online, and I saw that someone wrote, so this is interesting actually, David. I'm so glad I'm listening to this from my office and not the room, as I cannot help share a little tear with some of these speeches. Mm-hmm. So you also have some emotions in the individuality of people watching behind their screens in their offices or online. Try and get some feedback afterwards. I also very often insist that it's not a one-off. You can interact with some members of the audience before, online typically, and afterwards reach out and ask. And it's possible and likely you will still meet them later. So try and build this conversation afterwards to hear what they wanted to say, see how you can reply or use this to continue the conversation at a later occasion.
I'll make one more subtle point that is important to know about this. If you could have that Zoom speech be in front of some people, I would be willing to bet that person who was shedding a tear watching this online was partly moved by the fact that her or his fellow human beings she knew that they were in a room together. That even seeing this vicariously if I was just if I just showed her these videos, or if they were just on the YouTube, I'm not sure she would have had the same, or he or she would have had the same reaction. So there's like a vicarious thrill that people get from witnessing a speech with an audience in it. And so that's a way in which the magic that can happen in an in-person speech can be kind of spread and broadcast beyond the room, which I hope happened a little bit today.
Thank you for this. I mean, in the European Parliamentary Research Service, we have moved from less text to more speaking, and speaking in front of a camera and providing products online where a researcher explains the result of her or his research in different formats. And actually, you can test these formats. You can, between 3 minutes, between 1 minute, or longer product, you can choose and refine. This is something we are also in the process of learning. But what Isabel was saying at the beginning, that we have to move from there, namely a corner where we just give facts and figures, maybe to a bit more emotion, and to something that is more for a larger audience and so on. We are on the way between, and we are learning now. And I think that the crisis we have had, the COVID crisis, where we moved very much online, and now we are in hybrid format like today, has changed our work habits, and we are still refining what we are doing on our online presence. But there are ways to get feedback and to get better in this. Thanks. Any more? You want to comment? A question online, maybe? Isabel? Another in the room? Yes, in the front, please. Can you be short?
Okay, I will be super short. I'm Jutta, I'm also working in EPRS, and I had to get up to ask my question, so I will remain seated. You can see me. It was fantastic to listen to you, David, absolutely. I could sense the cumulative attention in this room. I've hardly seen any speaker getting so much attention, so really, congratulations. I was wondering, if we talk about success factors, I think it's, in the end, it's making the greatest possible impact through a speech. That's what it's all about. How would you rate the perfect preparation and rehearsal versus sensing the audience, versus having this social competence, I would call it, to really feel, to really start this dialogue with the audience and to adapt? I think Robert Kennedy was fantastic. You could really see that he was not delivering, obviously, you explained this very exceptional circumstance, but I think he was mastering, you know, this dialogue with the audience and reacting and staying agile at all stages. And I think probably the speaker has to be relaxed to some extent and master the subject very well. So I would be interested in terms of success factors. How do you rate one versus the other? Thank you so much.
Thank you. That's a great question, and I actually have thought a lot about that. First of all, that speech did look super impromptu, but if you think about it, that guy had been talking in terms like that all campaign. He'd been talking in terms like that for his whole political life. If you put Robert Kennedy in that situation in 1954 and not in 1968, I don't think he would have been, he may not have had the courage to go into that situation. He may not have occurred to him to do that, and I don't think he would have handled it as well. So you know, you can call that impromptu, and it was, but it was also in some ways rehearsed through a lifetime, and through his own brother's death and all that stuff that he drew on. I mean, for me, I think a lot of speakers don't rehearse because, and it's an excuse. Well, I want to be, I want to be spontaneous. You can be spontaneous if you truly have the material down cold. If you have the material down cold, I've given this talk all over the world. I can adjust to a mood in the room. I can adjust to a room where it's, you know, where people are really, I'm going to give this to a group of speechwriters. This was a harder speech to give because it's the same speech basically, but it's a harder speech to give because you're not all speechwriters. So when I go to give this to all speechwriters, it's like preaching to the choir. It's there, you know, people are going to be crying and jumping up and down. It's going to be fantastic. But this is a broader audience. So, but because I know the material and I know what I'm going to say, I can modulate my response, and I can actually spend part of my brain feeling the room and looking people in the eye and seeing how this stuff is landing. So I almost don't think you can ever rehearse too much. I think the wooden speeches are the speeches when the person's looking at it for the second time and reading the speech. So that's my thoughts on that.
Thank you, David. Some comments from online participation, Isabel, or
Yes.
comments on this one?
So there are many comments and questions coming online. Interestingly, the colleagues monitoring says there are more emojis than ever, like emotions and not necessarily words, which is a way to react even online, like the question we had earlier. There are so many questions. I will pick maybe 2 or 3 and you pick one. On the use, so how to get more attention? Someone suggests the use of pause. Someone else says, how can we get the attention from younger audience double screening? So which one would you, there are so many, so I suggest to take
polls, using polls. I don't know, I'm not a very, that seems like a level of complication for me. I'm not a very tech-friendly guy, and I actually think, you know, there's a lot of people, a lot of conferences want to have, you know, they want to have the Twitter board up, and they want to have all this stuff going on, and I want to do none of that at my conferences. I want people at my conference to forget that the rest of the world even exists. Just for 2 days, just for an hour, this is what it's about. All that other stuff doesn't exist. So I'm not a big poll. I wouldn't be that interested in polls. And in terms of engaging younger people, what was the other aspect of that question?
That was engaging younger generation who might be double screening more, and the pose. And you can choose just one.
Yes, and I honestly think if you're compelling, you're compelling, and if you have something to say, and you can get a younger person's attention. I do not think old people are just boring people that like to listen to boring speeches, and young people aren't. I think, you know, I think if you speak truly and speak to a young person, they'll listen no matter what. And I have a young person in my family, so.
Okay, I'm afraid to say that the success of an event is if there are still questions that are unanswered and conversations that could go on. We are reaching the time, and we have a technical constraint that we are cut after a certain time, and we have to finish this event. David promised to stay a couple of minutes in the room afterwards to have private conversations. So if you wish, so you can still talk to him. I would like to thank Isabel and David for this great event. And now we have a little bonus.
Fantastic. This is just about 5 minutes long. This is a clip that's near and dear to my heart. So we heard Robert Kennedy speak earlier. Here's his speechwriter. Adam Walensky, talking about a speech that the two of them worked on 50 years ago. It's not wanting to start.
So what was it like to write for him on that campaign?
That's what a campaign is. All you have is your words, right? His words.
Our first stop, one of Kennedy's speechwriters, Adam Walensky. His Colorado home is filled with the memorabilia of a life spent in politics. And all around are framed photos of him and Robert Kennedy. Walensky remembers one campaign speech in particular.
Our gross national product now is over $800 billion a year.
Lyndon Johnson had been bragging about the GNP numbers, which I think at that point had gotten to 800 billion. And so how terrific this was. And it really bothered Robert Kennedy. Didn't like it, and it bothered the hell out of me. So we worked out a little homily about what really counts in life.
But that gross national product, if we judge the United States of America by that gross national product counts air pollution and cigarette advertising.
The gross national product, that counts air pollution and cigarette advertising.
And ambulances to clear our highways of carnage.
Ambulances to clear our highways of carnage.
It counts special locks for our doors.
It counts special locks for our doors.
And the jails for the people who break them.
And jails for the people who break them.
Walensky isn't reading this speech.
He's sitting in front of me, eyes closed, and reciting it, word for word, from memory.
It counts the destruction of the redwoods and the loss of natural wonder and chaotic sprawl. It counts napalm.
It counts napalm.
And nuclear warheads.
It counts nuclear warheads.
And armored cars for the police to put down riots in our cities. And television programs that glorify violence in order to sell toys to our children.
And the television programs which glorify violence in order to sell toys to our children.
And he said if it includes all this, there is much that it does not count.
Yet the gross national product does not allow for the health of our children, the quality of their education, or the joy of their play. It does not include the beauty of our poetry, or the strength of our marriages, the intelligence of our public debate, or the integrity of our public officials.
It measures neither our wit nor our courage, neither our compassion nor our devotion to country. It measures everything in short except that which makes life worthwhile. And it can tell us everything about America except why we are proud to be Americans.
And it can tell us everything about America, except why we are proud that we are Americans.
And the thing about that was the passage that he used in speeches more than any other during the rest of that campaign. And I would be hesitant often to put that into the speech because, you know, we'd just done it so much. And I'd give him the draft and he would write little notes with a black pen and he would just put down GNP and underline it. So I would put it back in. Because those were the things that to him were important about the country and important about the way we should live. Who else is there who talks like that?
And I'll only add that all political leaders, in their own personal style, appropriate to their own culture and in their own way, all leaders need to talk like that. Thank you, everybody. Enjoyed this.
Thank you. Thank you also to the technicians and the organization team. Very successful. And just to announce that the next event will be on the 12th of April at noon, and it's about EU-China relations, the way forward.